first, I would like to say just two things about one of the many reasons I love this play, so that maybe that's also going to inform the type of approach of my presentation, and you're going to understand where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to show and share with you. So I'm fascinated by this play's use of a fictional country to bring so much truth to the history of Latin America. I feel like this touches me very personally because as a Latin American in the US, I often feel as though my identity as a Latin American is kind of overwritten by or diluted in a more vague and often misunderstood identity of Latinx, which I identify with both, but the Latin American always seems to be taking a back seat. And it's almost as if we Latin Americans had to leave our story behind once we cross the border or once we get off the plane. And I think that this story of courage and compassion that Crumbs brings us, it's a story of condemnation too, and I feel it as a vindication of that original identity, of that the original Latin American identity that I identify most with. So you might notice that the topics that I'm going to touch, they might seem maybe a little general at times. I'm also going to be very specific, but they're big topics. And I think I read somewhere that the US empire thrives in amnesia. So I think that it's important to fix that and not thrive in amnesia and just remember and know the history. So Rebecca tells us that the inspiration for Canto Rica comes from the history of several countries whose fates were affected or intersected with US involvement. According to the play, we can locate Cantuta Rica somewhere in Central America, close to Belize. I mean, we know it's close to Belize, so we can assume it's Central America. But the name brings to mind a couple of different things. I mean, on the one hand, it makes us think of Costa Rica because of the name Rica, which means rich, but also Cantu and Cantuta, those two words that are from indigenous languages of the Andes regions, designate the name of a flower. So this the national flower of Peru and Bolivia. So we already see that we have a couple of things going on in terms of influences. So I would like to talk a little bit about US interventions and state terrorism. I will use the term intervention, and I will also talk about state terrorism. I tend to not want to just talk about interventions because there's kind of like a harmless connotation to that word, whereas state terrorism is a little more specific. State terrorism refers to acts of terrorism that a state conducts against another state or against its own people. And terrorism is different from war in that it refers to the use of violence, generally against non-combatants, with the intention to achieve political ends. So Rebecca shared with us that, and I'm sure you guys received the document, there's a ton of resources, so I'm going to encourage you to read through those, ask if you have any questions for her, or for me, or for Kelly. I'm going to try not to repeat what's there and just expand, but of course there are some things that I also found out about the play that I didn't know, that I found out through those resources. And one of the things that I found out that is that she was mainly thinking about the histories of El Salvador, Panama, Nicaragua, and a little bit of Venezuela when she was writing this play. And if you get, if you find resemblance to other countries, it's because when we look at the history of US interventions. Sometimes it seems like the same textbook is followed and the same script is followed. So there's a lot of things that are similar throughout the continent. I would say that, just to get us started, in a continent where European colonialism left a very unequal class structure, there were a lot of movements of social transformation and redistribution of wealth that emerged and encountered the opposition of the local elites and the opposition of powerful local and foreign corporations, often in alliance with the military, the local military, and backed by the US through the CIA, the DOD, the State Department, different offices. And these conflicts sometimes took the form of dictatorships, sometimes led to civil war, and in most cases, they left a large number of civilians killed or disappeared by death squads. And these death squads responded to the local military and responded also directly or indirectly to the US. The conflicts also left a lot of people, survivors who endured torture, people who had to go into exile, and what's in place now, it's a more modern version of the equally unequal societies that the progressive movements of the 70s and 80s were trying to change. And specifically when it comes to Central America, it has been said that the US applied all the lessons learned in Vietnam. I like using this example because people are a lot more familiar probably with Vietnam than with the conflicts in Central America, even though we share the same continent. In Latin America, we talk about one continent: North America, Central America, and South America, all one continent. So the US used some of the lessons that they had learned in Vietnam, applying violent tactics and seeking ways of winning the hearts and minds of the population, just like they had tried to do in Vietnam through psychological warfare. So the play refers to historical events that happened 15 years ago, but the factual basis takes us both farther in time to the 70s and 80s, and to examples that are more recent, more of the last 10 years. And we can find those examples in countries like Honduras, Venezuela, and Bolivia. So I'm gonna do a quick background review of some of these conflicts that I think are gonna be helpful. And I always like starting, I mean, when I say always, I mean because I used to teach college and like teach some of these conflicts in that context, and it's such a big topic, and I think it's important to understand where things come from. Like, again, like knowing what the history is so that we can get a little more specific. So I like starting with the Monroe Doctrine, and I don't know how many of you may have heard. You probably have, but I think a refresher is a good idea for understanding the world of this play. So this was a policy from 1823, a policy of non-European interference in the Western Hemisphere that became broadly interpreted much later, after the US emerged as a world superpower. And then there was a corollary to that in 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary, by which, in cases of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American country, the US could intervene in that country's internal affairs. You probably have heard the phrase associated with this doctrine, which is America for Americans. So what does that really mean? It means America for US Americans. And I think it's interesting to look at the phrase in Spanish, because in Spanish, America para los Americanos, which is, we know this phrase in Latin America very well. It literally means America for the America as in the continent, for Americans as in the people who live in the continent, in the entire continent. But really what it means is America para los estadounidenses, so meaning America for the US Americans. So it's an interesting play, given that the US has taken the name of the entire continent to name just the country. So the Monroe Doctrine established a standard for the policies of the US towards Latin America throughout all of the last century and even until today. It has been defined as one of the most significant of all of US foreign policy papers. And it came out of an address to Congress by President James Monroe after the wars of independence in the Americas, the wars mostly against Spain. And the US saw that some European nations, especially Russia and France, they had their eyes on some of these colonies. They had intentions of colonizing or recolonizing. So Great Britain wanted to issue a joint declaration against European involvement in the Americas, but Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was suspicious of British intentions for a good reason, and convinced President Monroe to go alone. So the US ended up signing this alone. And Monroe's statement basically talked about keeping Europe off the Western Hemisphere, but it didn't say anything about the US keeping its own hands off of the hemisphere. So it was during Wilson's era, much later, that the Monroe Doctrine started to provide the basis for every policy in regards to Latin America. And it established the Western Hemisphere and the US as a new agent of world progress. And it became universal. It provided a blend of unilateralism and opportunism. That was kind of like a perfect blend for the US to act in regards to other countries in the region. And I think it's become so ubiquitous in the US, in the culture and the ideology, that it has become naturalized. So I think people are not often aware that this exists. And I think this is so important for our play to understand some of the ideology behind these characters. So just to go really quick through these, between the presidencies of the two Roosevelts, Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, the US intervened frequently in Latin America, especially in the Caribbean. Then during the Cold War era, we have several instances. We have Kennedy. He invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the 1962 missile crisis with Cuba. Reagan used the doctrine to justify intervention in El Salvador, in Nicaragua. Bush Sr. used the doctrine to justify the invasion of Panama, all of which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then with the end of the Cold War and the dawn of the 21st century, the doctrine has not been invoked as frequently because the US is not involved with the military as much as it used to be, but it still has a very powerful influence in the way that the US conducts its affairs in the region. So a quick review of some of the countries that gave most of the inspiration for this play. El Salvador is one. Between 1980 and 1992, there was a civil war between the military-led government and the leftist Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. The front was named after communist leader Farabundo Martí, who led a peasant rebellion in the 1930s, which had also been opposed by the US. And under Presidents Carter, Reagan, and Bush Sr., the US armed, supported, trained, and participated alongside the Salvadoran armed forces against the FMLN. We could talk all day about this war, this conflict. The human cost was enormous. It's estimated that there were 80,000 people who were killed during this time. And something else to know about El Salvador that is very relevant. I'm smiling because I was so moved when I confirmed that the name San Romero, I had thought of Oscar Romero when I first read Rebecca's pieces, the first scenes of the play, and San Romero came up as the name of the capital of Cantuta Rica. And it brought to mind the San Salvador's Archbishop Oscar Romero, and then I found out that was actually the inspiration for the name of the capital of this fictional country. So I was very moved by that. He was San Salvador's, the capital of El Salvador's Archbishop, and he was killed after he was given the day after he gave a sermon calling on Salvadoran soldiers as Christians to obey God's higher order and stop carrying out repression against the people and violating human rights. And he was coming out of church and he was assassinated. So that's where the name of the capital comes from. So we have Nicaragua, in some ways similar history as in El Salvador, because we're talking about a movement, a revolution that happened in the 1930s that was crashed, and then there was a revival of those ideals later on. In this case, we're talking about the Sandinista Revolution. So they won in 1979, and they formed a progressive government that was a blend of, the Sandinista Liberation Front, which still exists and still governs the country with very different ideas. This all has happened very long time ago. Was a coalition of social democrats, socialists, Marxist Leninists, groups influenced by theology of liberation or liberation theology. And the US at that time imposed an economic blockade against Nicaragua and organized a counter-revolutionary right-wing insurgency. And you may have heard of the Contras. And so the Contras were basically fighting against this new government, and the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, that's the name of the front, is named after Augusto Sandino, who led a revolution against the occupation of Nicaragua, the US occupation of Nicaragua in the 30s too, between 1927 and 1933. So again, some similarities with El Salvador. Also a huge cost, 60,000 or 65,000 people is the estimate, people who were killed during this conflict. And then we have Panama, which is maybe one of the biggest influences, I think, for Crumbs, specifically the invasion of Panama in 1989. At that time, Bush Sr. sent 27,000 troops to invade this country. This country is 5 times smaller than California, to overthrow Manuel Noriega, who was a former CIA friend / asset, killing many thousands. I wrote the number 5,000, which is also the number that Rebecca has in mind. I think it's not a number. There's no consensus because there's just like a lot that we don't know about that invasion, and a lot that is not talked about, and left a lot of people homeless. And the photo here shows the neighborhood of El Chorrillo, which is a working class neighborhood in Panama that was destroyed by US artillery. Just in one day, there were like 400 bombs that were dropped. And that's why people started calling this neighborhood Little Hiroshima or Guernica. So I have a couple more things about Panama. Our photographer in the play, his name is inspired also by real events. The name of Juancho Rodriguez, who was a photographer from El País, the Spanish newspaper. He was shot and killed by an American soldier after he took the photograph that we see. And we see him too here with his curly hair. And I have a couple more pictures to show of the invasion. I think it's useful to have these things in mind as we're thinking about. This is very much the kind of invasion that Ivan is thinking about when he's talking against the US. And a quick thing, another quick note on Panama. There have been many mysterious plane crashes in the history of Latin America. A lot of politicians who were killed in these crashes. But the one that Rebecca had in mind when she wrote the play was Omar Torrijos of Panama, who was the supreme leader of the Panamanian Revolution, which came before Manuel Noriega. And his plane crashed in 1981, somewhat mysteriously. Is attributed to the CIA. I think until today we don't have clear answers from the US, but that's the I guess the historical event that inspired that aspect of the plot. So, again, as I said, Manuel Noriega was a long-time CIA asset. He was known for trafficking a lot of drugs. He had been trained in the School of the Americas. You may have heard the US School of the Americas, which was first in Panama, and then it was moved to the US, and then more recently, after 9/11, it was renamed, but it still exists, and it's also known as School of the Assassins. It's a school that trains Latin American officers in basically intelligence and torture tactics. And so a lot of the military commanders and leaders of the different dictatorships in Latin America were trained there. And Manuel Noriega had been trained there. So he was a friend of the US and he was providing a lot of support to the US in the Contra War in Nicaragua, as well as in El Salvador. When he started not cooperating so much and he started talking about taking back the Panama Canal from the US, Bush Sr. Decided that was enough and Noriega had to go, and that's how the invasion was planned, which was condemned by the UN, by the way. And then a little bit more, I'm not going to talk about all of these countries, don't worry, but as I was coming up with a list, I ended up writing so many, thinking of so many different conflicts that I ended up pretty much writing the names of every country in Latin America. Like every single country in Latin America has had some form of intervention of US-supported state terrorism. To think more about more recent examples that I think are also very helpful when we're thinking about this play, since this is a more contemporary setting. I think Venezuela is a good example. Venezuela suffered, since the arrival of Hugo Chavez to the presidency in 1999, systematic attacks by the US, including a coup in 2002. Many people don't even know about the coup. Basically, the US does not accept that a Latin American people can be sovereign and can dispose of its economic resources and follow its own policy. That's really what it comes down to. So Chavez played a key role in organizing the working class in Venezuela and raising political awareness and improving the living conditions of the poor, the great majority. I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions about this and a lot of just like a lot of controversy around his figure. He created, when we think about oil as a very precious resource, we often think about war, right? Oil in connection to war. In the case of Venezuela, what the so-called Bolivarian revolution of Chavez, what they did was exchange oil for doctors and teachers. So they took doctors and teachers from Cuba and gave Cuba oil. So that was one of the things that the that the so-called Bolivarian Revolution did. And a few years after Chavez assumed the presidency, Venezuela became a country free of illiteracy by the UNESCO. So those are some of the things that we don't hear about. And it's like, I'm not talking in favor of against any government here, but like just some facts that are not often cited that I think are very useful in understanding the conflict between these characters. Honduras is another recent example. In 2001, there was a left-leaning, democratically elected president. His name was Manuel Zelaya, and he was pursuing progressive policies like raising the minimum wage and subsidizing public transportation, that kind of thing. And he was exiled after a military coup. The coup was staged after Zelaya had announced his intentions of reforming the constitution, because the constitution had been approved during times of a US-backed dictatorship. So the Honduran general who led the coup, again, was a graduate of the School of the Americas. This is very recent history, so we keep seeing the same thing. And the US under Obama and under Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State refused to condemn the coup and refused to call to join the international call for an immediate release and return of Zelaya, because Zelaya was just inconvenient for the US, and Hillary Clinton says as much explicitly in her autobiography, Hard Choices. So I don't want to just focus on the physically violent aspects of US, because there's just a lot more. I think it would be insufficient if we only talked about the armed conflicts. There's also the corporate plundering, the neoliberal draining and undermining of resources of these countries, which has pushed many nations like Costa Rica into poverty, instability, and violence. So for decades, I think these US policies of military intervention paired with economic neoliberalism have undermined democracies in the region and have made it so that there's like so many vacuums in the different countries, vacuums of power, that those vacuums were filled with drug cartels and paramilitary alliances and so on. So this is hard. This is difficult history. I would like to move us over to a little bit of political theory, and I apologize in advance because I feel that for those of you who are familiar with the terms that we're going to discuss, Marxism, communism, socialism, this is going to seem incredibly reductive. And if you're not so familiar, it's going to seem very confusing. So I apologize in advance. I'm here to answer questions. We can keep talking about this. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of conversations with Ivan about his ideas. So just to give you an overview, and you can always refer back to this presentation where maybe some of these definitions might be useful. So let's talk about Marxism first. So Marxism is a philosophy and political theory founded by Karl Marx, which has had a fundamental role in criticizing capitalist society, promoting the organization of the working class throughout the world to put an end to that form of organization and to replace it by another form. So Marx's great contribution is not just imagining a society of the future, but having a fierce and scientifically based critique of bourgeois society, which is the society in which we live. So the diagnosis of capitalism is essential for those who want to change that and imagine a different society. That's why no philosopher knows capitalism better than Marx. And so some of the things that Marx talked about, we're going to talk about socialism and communism. So socialism is a transition phase towards communism. It's the type of social system that where the popular majorities led by the proletariat, which is a class of industrial workers, the people who they don't own their means of production, so they have to sell their labor in order to live. So that class takes over the bourgeois state with the aim of breaking the power of the bourgeoisie. So in this system, we have a type of justice by which, Marx said, from each according to their ability. Then we have the higher phase, which comes after socialism, which is communism. So it's a higher phase of the previous process. So this is a society without classes and therefore without the state, conceived of as Marx as a realm of equality, freedom, and diversity, self-emancipation of the great majorities. Communism can also be understood as the movement that leads to a classless society. So it's not just a station of arrival, it's a process, it's in constant motion. And the type of justice that communism aims to attain is to each according to their need, which is also called substantive justice. So it's not a formal justice like the one in socialism, it's a substantive justice. So to each according to their abilities or skills, that's socialism. You treat everyone equally, even though not everyone is equal, people have different needs. So this type of justice does not end up breaking the bourgeois justice. It's just, it has a little bit more of what still, because it's a transition phase, it has not achieved its full potential. The full potential would be to each according to their needs. So you treat people unequally in order to achieve a real equal society. So the implication is that true justice is only achieved by treating people in an unequal way with the aim of achieving equality. And this differentiation comes from Aristotle, and Marx theorizes and uses it for his in his philosophy. So then we have Leninism. Leninism is the form of Marxism put into practice in a very concrete example, the example of the Soviet Revolution. So we're talking about a country like Russia that of the first decades of the 20th century that had suffered great economic and social backwardness. So Leninism refers to what would be the brightest and most democratic moment of the Russian Revolution and lasts until Vladimir Lenin's death in 1924. It's a strongly international movement. So it means the idea is that communism cannot survive just in one country. It has to be an international movement. And then we have Stalinism, which is a degeneration of the Russian revolutionary process. And that was promoted by Joseph Stalin. So what was born as a project with a revolutionary vocation, which sought to export socialism to other countries in the world, was transformed into a very repressive regime that no longer aspired to the Marxist ideal of exporting the revolution to other places. And it became kind of like the project of socialism in one country. And the authoritarian regime that was led by Stalin achieved such an accelerated process of economic development at a very, very high human cost that the USSR was transformed in a very short amount of time in one of the world's great superpowers. And then I think this is the last slide about political economy, and we're going to wrap it up pretty soon. Anarchism. So anarchism would be the attempt to reach the classless society by a shortcut, by proposing not the prior conquest of the state that we saw in in socialism and communism, but the destruction, a quick destruction of the state. So for anarchists, the destruction of the state would make it possible to defeat the bourgeoisie. It's a very diverse movement that includes individualist and collective branches. And it might also include agitators, which might explain why Ivan conflates the two terms. And since we're talking about anarchism, I think also it's important to talk a little bit about the Paris Commune, which is part of one of Ivan's monologues. So the Paris Commune happened in the wake of France's defeat in the Franco-German War, and the collapse of the Second Empire of Napoleon III. It was a popular-led democratic government that ruled Paris from March to May of 1871. It was very short, like Ivan says. It was inspired by the Marxist ideals and revolutionary goals of the First International. And the workers of Paris united to overthrow the existing French regime that had failed to protect them from the Prussian siege to the city. And they formed the first truly democratic government in all of France. They elected a council that passed socialist policies, and they introduced reforms that were very advanced for the time and even for today's standards. They abolished death penalty and military conscription. They ended night work for people who worked in bakeries. They gave pensions to families, widows, those who were killed defending the commune. They abolished the accrual of interests in debts. They ruled that workers could take over businesses that closed, so they could form cooperatives. They gave women the right to an equal divorce, which is like amazing, 1871. And if Ivan's audience is sophisticated enough, I think they would know that the commune was a socialist experiment, not an anarchist experiment. So this is interesting that he talks about the commune as an example of anarchism. I think this is it as far as politics and history. I do want to make sure that we are all on the same page with the story of Hansel and Gretel. Let me know if it's redundant to review it, or we can just review it really quick. Maybe like, can I get thumbs up if we need to talk about it? Okay, cool. So Hansel and Gretel, we all probably know the story, but like knowing the details and just finding the little gems in this story that we can see in this brilliant play, this version that Crumbs gives us, I think it's important to just go over that really quick. So we have a poor woodcutter and his wife. They live with their children, Hansel and Gretel. They are the woodcutter's children. The wife is not their mother is dead. The family is very poor, and the stepmother convinces the father that they can get rid of the children so that they don't have so many mouths to feed. So the stepmother decides that they're going to abandon the children in the forest. So Hansel and Gretel overhear the conversation, and Hansel makes a plan. He fills his coat with pieces of flint so that the next morning when they are taken to the forest, he drops the flints and that way they can find their way back. So they find their way back. The stepmother is not happy. She convinces the father of doing it again, so they try again. This time they lock the children so that Hansel cannot go out and cannot get the flint in his pockets. So this time when they're taken to the forest, Hansel uses pieces of bread, crumbs, from the last piece of bread that they had to eat, and he drops them in the forest. But as we all probably remember, the birds eat the crumbs, and so once they're abandoned, they're not able to find their way back. So after, I think, 3 days of being in the forest by themselves, they come across a house, a beautiful house that is made of sugar and sweets. It's built of bread and roofed with cakes, says the story. The window is made of clear sugar, and they start eating the house. because they're so hungry, they haven't eaten in days. The owner of the house turns out to be this very old woman who invites them in, and she sees how hungry they are, so she feeds them a large meal. But we find out she's an evil witch, and she has the habit of fattening kids up so that she can eat them. So she locks Hansel in the stables, and she has Gretel prepare meals daily to feed them to Hansel so that he can get fat, and then at some point she can eat him. Well, she's gonna eat them, but she's fattening up Hansel. So Gretel does that. She's desperate. She doesn't know what to do. Eventually, the time comes. Oh, in the meantime, the witch checks to make sure that he's getting fat, and Hansel puts out a little piece of a bone to pretend that that's him who is not getting fat. And eventually, the witch decides she's gonna eat him anyway. So she starts preparing the stove. She asks Gretel to step in to check if the stove is ready. Gretel, she's very smart, and she gets the witch to demonstrate how to check if the stove is hot. So when the witch does that, she pushes her into the stove. So the witch burns, and then the kids are able to be freed up. They plunder the woman's house. They find precious stones and pearls, and so they take these riches with them, and then eventually they're able to find their way back home. They have to cross a river, get on top of a duck, and they are able to finally arrive home, and they have their father waiting for them. The stepmother has conveniently died in the meantime, so they are happy, and they're not gonna go hungry anymore, because they have all this stuff that they took from the witch's house. So that's the story. And in the brilliant naming of these characters in this play, we have Ivan, who is Hansel, and both names, this is all provided by Rebecca. You can always go back to the document that she sent. The names mean God is gracious, both Ivan and Hansel. Marilena means she's Gretel, and that means pearl, which also in Spanish, Marilena means star of the sea. Adelio, the wood, is of course the father, the woodcutter. Adelio means father of the noble prince, and selva in Spanish means rainforest. Alaya is the witch in the candy house, and her first name means something close to sweet of speech, and her last name, Almanza, means the house, as in the candy house. Almanza is in an Arabic name, like she says in the play. We have a lot of names in Spain that come from Arabic because of the Moorish influence in the Arabic influence in Spain. So those are the names that I think are just so clever, among many other things in this play that are clever and amazing.